Frank Lloyd Wright, Innovations in Green Architecture by Tom Compass. By considering the sun and the landscape around his buildings, Frank Lloyd Wright broke free from conventional 19th century architecture to create a form of green architecture that is still influential today. Frank Lloyd Wright was born in 1867 in Richland Center, Wisconsin, but he didn't stay there for long. His father was insatiably restless, and Wright spent most of his very early life traveling all around America. The family eventually settled in Madison, Wisconsin. Wright's mother had decided before he was born that he was going to be a famous architect. For as long as she was living, she kept trying to steer him in that direction, and apparently did a good job of it. He spent his summers with his mother's family in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and throughout his childhood, he managed to find nature and the beauty of it.
This is called the Lloyd Jones Valley, which is the name of his mother's family, the Lloyd Joneses. His mother was born in Wales, so he's a first-generation immigrant.
Okay.
And so they came here and were farmers. So he would come here in summers and work on the land. And so I think that was an important start for him to be an immigrant.
In his biography, he wrote, "And the trees stood in it all like various beautiful buildings, of more different kinds than all the architectures of the world. Someday this boy was to learn that the secret of all styles of architecture was the same secret that gave character to the trees." When Wright went to college and later studied with the famous Chicago architect Louis Sullivan, he was very aware of the predominant architectural styles of the time, but he never fully followed them. In the late 1800s, most architects in America and elsewhere were mainly focusing on form and not the function of a building.
He was reacting against a tradition of architecture which was very picturesque or painterly. So there were little turrets and little bay windows and so on, and there was no sense of order to it.
These architectural styles include Queen Anne, Classical Revival, Shingle styles, and others. Queen Anne, for 1/3 of Frank Lloyd Wright's life, was widely used style, involving wooden turrets with windows and little ornate wood carvings all around the building called spindlework, along with a steep roof incline. Queen Anne's style mostly disappeared in the early 20th century, mainly because the wooden and ornamental buildings were hard to upkeep. Shingle style was derived from Queen Anne, but was a simplified version of it. After World War II, the battle-hardened soldiers wanted something new and implacable, not this frilly stuff. So a flattened Europe was replaced with a new style called modernism.
The modern architects, quote unquote, were not particularly interested in nature. They were interested in the machine, and the fact that they were singular in that emphasis was why he found them inadequate.
Modernism, at least according to Frank Lloyd Wright, was a cold, hard style that had no soul, even though many famous modernists were very heavily influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, and some say he was the one who started it. It was characterized by use of concrete, glass, and had none of the form that was popular before. It had gone from pure form to pure function.
Organic to him meant wholeness. The parts are all brought together. Grew, it was not assembled. So it was the idea of things merging one with the other. And so rooms lead into rooms. In other words, there's a merging. It isn't a series of boxes. It's transitions from one location to the other. The building merges with the site, and the life that goes on within the building is merged with both of those things. So it's this notion of taking parts and making sure they combine. That to me is what ultimately the simplest definition of organic for him.
Unlike other architects of his time, Frank Lloyd Wright found a balance between form and function, which he called organic architecture. It was the concept that all of his styles were built on. That, in part, is why you can almost immediately tell a building was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Organic architecture is not organic meaning a living thing, but organic in the fact that the entire building serves one purpose. Although he wasn't trying to be what we think of as a green architect, Frank Lloyd Wright started the concept and some of the founding ideas of today's green architecture, and he would have a large influence on future architects.
The idea of a two-story wall with a hat on it is not like any environment, any natural environment. So if you bring the house down and you spread it out, all of a sudden you're part of the landscape in a way that a white box sitting on the hill would not be. The fact that he liked overhangs was not because he was an environmentalist only. He realized that he could shade them, but it was a formal thing about the relationship to the landscape. Interesting.
Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings were definitely not white boxes on a hill. They were very different than other houses of the time, and they used things like long overhangs, materials from the building site, and radiant heat floors. First of all, many of his buildings are characterized by long overhangs over large windows. Long overhangs can play a big part in heating and cooling a building if used well. In the summer, when the sun is high, the long overhangs shade the building and windows. In the winter, however, the overhangs let the light through the glass into the building. They also let light heat up the exterior walls. This alone cannot heat and cool a building, but it can help. This feature is very apparent in the Jacobs House and the Robbie House.
Frank Lloyd Wright did some amazing things with the position of his building and how he had sunlight come into the building and how he shaded his building.
Using materials from around the building site is another important part of green building. Frank Lloyd Wright used local materials in many of his buildings. The Unitarian Meeting House in Madison and Wright's home in Taliesin are two examples of this technique. Wood, stone, and other building materials are heavy and require lots of resources to move from place to place. When you use the materials from the building site or near the site, you greatly reduce the resources used and the cost of building and reduce environmental impact. Radiant heat is another aspect that Frank Lloyd Wright incorporated into his buildings that relates to green architecture today. Although he didn't invent it, he brought it over to the Western world from Asia. Radiant floors have many advantages, namely, they use less energy, reduce heat loss, and can use water heated by the sun. The Jacobs House, too, in Madison, has radiant heat. These concepts that Frank Lloyd Wright developed are still used more than ever today with the growing popularity of green building. They can be very clearly seen in the addition to the Unitarian Meeting House, originally built by Frank Lloyd Wright. Since Frank Lloyd Wright used the sun in the landscape, so did the modern architects, and, along with many other environmental additions, such as green roofs, they achieved this high standard. The addition is clearly influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, with the huge windows facing the natural setting, and the roof covered with small plants to make it look like an extension of the hill. This influence, not just in green architecture, still plays a part and will for many years to come. Inspired by nature as a child, Frank Lloyd Wright carried that influence through his life and his buildings. Although he was not considered a green architect at the time, his ideas became some of the founding principles of green architecture.